Rain pounded the streets as a black SUV screeched around the corner, its tires splashing through puddles. Inside, a figure sat hunched over a laptop, face illuminated by the eerie glow of the screen. This was no ordinary commute. A high-stakes game of cat and mouse was unfolding in the shadows of the suburban neighborhood. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had to get the information out before they caught up to her. Glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, she saw the flashing lights of a pursuit closing in. Time was running out. Suddenly, a loud thud on the roof made her jump. "They found me," she gasped, swerving to avoid a collision. Fingers trembling, she typed furiously, uploading the last of the incriminating data. A triumphant grin flashed across her face as the progress bar hit 100%. But her victory was short-lived. The SUV lurched as something heavy landed on the hood, obscuring her view. Struggling to maintain control, Sarah caught a glimpse of a monstrous figure, eyes glowing, teeth bared in a feral snarl. "No, it can't be," she breathed, her heart pounding. The creature ripped through the windshield, shards of glass flying everywhere. Sarah braced for the impact, but it never came. Instead, a pair of powerful hands seized her by the collar and yanked her out of the vehicle. As the ground rushed up to meet her, Sarah caught a glimpse of her pursuer, a hulking, inhuman form with razor-sharp claws and pulsing, neon-green veins. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. This was no ordinary thug or henchman. This was something far more terrifying. The creature loomed over her, a twisted grin spreading across its distorted features. "You've interfered with our plans for the last time, Mrs. Donovan," it growled, its voice a guttural, animalistic rumble. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. She had to warn the others, to expose the truth before it was too late. But as the creature's claws closed around her throat, all she could think about was the fate that awaited her. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of evidence as the SUV burst into flames. In the distance, a siren wailed, but it was already too late. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time the police arrived, but the air was still thick with tension. Officers swarmed the scene, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they combed the area for clues. Among them was Detective Jackson, a seasoned veteran with a keen eye for detail. He crouched beside the smoking wreckage, his brow furrowed in concentration. Something about this case didn't sit right with him. "What do we know so far?" he asked, glancing up at the younger officer standing beside him. "The vehicle is registered to a Sarah Donovan," the officer replied, consulting his notepad. Neighbors reported hearing a commotion and seeing the SUV swerving out of control before it crashed. Jackson nodded, his gaze drifting to the scorched remains of the car. "And the body." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "There's no body, sir. It's like she just vanished." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. No one just vanishes from a crash like this." Straightening up, he surveyed the scene, his mind racing. Something wasn't adding up, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Across town, in the heart of the affluent Oakwood subdivision, the Homeowners Association, HOA, held an emergency meeting. The members, all well-dressed and meticulously groomed, gathered around a long mahogany table, their expressions grim. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Blackwood, the HOA's formidable president. Her icy blue eyes swept across the room, silencing the murmurs with a single piercing glare. "As you all know, one of our own has betrayed us," she began, her voice low and measured. "Sarah Donovan has been interfering with our operations, and we can no longer tolerate her meddling." A hush fell over the room, the tension palpable. The HOA was a powerful entity with its fingers in every aspect of the community's affairs. To defy them was to invite disaster. "We must act swiftly and decisively," Evelyn continued, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the HOA members. Sarah Donovan has been disposed of, but there are still others who threaten to expose our secrets. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. From this day forward, we will no longer tolerate any resistance to our authority. Our community will be brought to heel, no matter the cost. The HOA members exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the ominous shift in the air. Evelyn's words had the weight of a dire warning, and they knew better than to challenge her. As the meeting drew to a close, Evelyn lingered, her gaze fixed on the charred remains of Sarah's SUV. A faint smile played at the corners of her lips, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light. "It's time to take the gloves off," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "The game has changed, and we can't afford to lose." Back at the crash site, Detective Jackson stood alone, his mind whirling with unanswered questions. This was no ordinary case, and he knew it. As he turned to leave, a sudden realization struck him. What the hell is going on in this town? He muttered, his eyes narrowing with determination. He was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. The next morning, the residents of Oakwood woke to find their neighborhood transformed. Overnight, a series of new community guidelines had been posted on every street corner, their bold, black lettering a stark contrast to the manicured lawns and meticulously maintained facades. All residents must report any suspicious activity to the HOA immediately. Outdoor gatherings of more than 4 people are strictly prohibited. Failure to comply with HOA rules will result in immediate fines and potential homeowner eviction. The message was clear. The HOA was tightening its grip, and anyone who dared to defy them would face the consequences. Among the first to notice the changes was Emily Wilkins, a young mother who had recently moved into the neighborhood. As she pushed her stroller down the sidewalk, her eyes scanned the unfamiliar guidelines, a growing sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. "What is going on?" she murmured, her brow furrowed in confusion. Oakwood had always been known for its pristine appearance and strict adherence to community rules, but this felt different, more oppressive, somehow. Hurrying past the watchful eyes of her neighbors, Emily made her way to the HOA office, determined to get some answers. But as she approached the door, a pair of burly security guards stepped into her path, their expressions unreadable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the HOA office is closed to the public until further notice," one of the guards said, his voice gruff and unyielding. Emily's eyes widened in alarm. "But I need to speak with someone about these new rules. They can't just—" "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the guard interrupted, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. Realizing she was outmatched, Emily reluctantly turned and headed back the way she had come, her mind racing. Something was very wrong in Oakwood, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. Across town, Detective Jackson sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the worn surface as he pored over the case files. The disappearance of Sarah Donovan had only raised more questions, and he was no closer to finding answers. Suddenly, his phone rang, the shrill tone cutting through the silence of the precinct. "Jackson," he answered, his voice clipped and professional. "Detective, it's Emily Wilkins. I think I might have some information about what's going on in Oakwood." Jackson's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. "Go on." Emily quickly filled him in on the new HOA guidelines and the strange encounter at the office. "Something's not right, detective. The HOA is acting like they're running some kind of police state, and I'm worried about what they might be up to." Jackson's brow furrowed as he listened, his mind whirring with possibilities. "This sounds like more than just a case of overzealous homeowners association. I'm going to need you to keep an eye on things and report back to me, Ms. Wilkins. And be careful. Whoever is behind this isn't messing around." "I will, detective," Emily replied, her voice laced with determination. "I'm not going to let them get away with this." As the call ended, Jackson leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The pieces were starting to come together, but the bigger picture was still maddeningly elusive. One thing was clear, though: the stakes had just been raised, and the battle for control of Oakwood was about to get a whole lot uglier. In the darkness of her palatial home, Evelyn Blackwood pored over a series of surveillance feeds. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. The HOA's network of hidden cameras had captured every move, every interaction, and she was determined to leave nothing to chance. "So, the detective is sniffing around," she murmured, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the desk. "And that Wilkins woman is proving to be more of a nuisance than I anticipated." A faint smile played at the corners of her lips as she leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping across the various screens. The pieces were falling into place, and soon her vision for Oakwood would be realized. Across town, Emily Wilkins sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in front of her. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the strange events unfolding in her once peaceful neighborhood. "There has to be something we can do," she muttered, her brow furrowed in frustration. She had tried to rally her neighbors, but most of them seemed too cowed by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics to even consider resistance. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. Cautiously, she peered through the peephole, only to find Detective Jackson standing on her doorstep, his expression grim. "Detective," she said, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" "I need to speak with you, Ms. Wilkins," Jackson replied, his voice low. "It's about the situation in Oakwood, and I think you might be in danger." Emily's eyes widened, and she quickly ushered him inside, her heart pounding. "What do you mean, in danger? What's going on?" Jackson took a deep breath, his gaze darting around the room as if he expected to be overheard. "I've been doing some digging, and it seems like the HOA is a lot more than just a group of overbearing homeowners." He paused, his expression darkening. "They're involved in something bigger, something that they're willing to kill to keep hidden." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, and she found herself instinctively glancing over her shoulder. "You mean Sarah Donovan?" Jackson nodded grimly. "I don't think she just disappeared from the crash site. I think the HOA had her killed to silence her." Emily's hands trembled as she took in the gravity of his words. "But why? What are they hiding?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Jackson replied. "But it's clear that they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets. And that means anyone who gets in their way is in danger." Emily felt a surge of fear, but also a growing determination. "Then we have to stop them. We can't just let them get away with this." Jackson held up a hand, his expression serious. "I understand your desire to fight back, but we need to be careful. The HOA has eyes and ears everywhere in this community. We can't afford to make any reckless moves." Leaning forward, he fixed Emily with a piercing gaze. "That's why I need your help, Ms. Wilkins. You're in a unique position to gather information and help me build a case against the HOA. But you have to be smart about it, and you have to be willing to take some risks." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She knew the stakes were high, but the thought of letting the HOA continue their reign of terror was unacceptable. Taking a deep breath, she met Jackson's gaze with a steely determination. "What do you need me to do?" The rain had finally stopped, but the air in Oakwood was thick with tension. Residents moved about nervously, their eyes darting from side to side as they scanned the streets for any sign of the HOA's watchful presence. Emily Wilkins tried her best to blend in, her expression carefully neutral as she strolled past the newly installed security cameras. Detective Jackson had tasked her with gathering as much information as possible, but she knew the risks were high. "Keep your head down and don't draw any unnecessary attention," he had warned her. "The HOA has eyes everywhere, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their operation." As she made her way down the sidewalk, Emily couldn't help but notice the changes that had been made to the neighborhood. Meticulously manicured lawns had been replaced by rows of security fencing, and the once friendly residents now eyed each other with suspicion. Suddenly, a familiar figure caught her eye. It was Evelyn Blackwood, the formidable president of the HOA, striding down the street with a pair of burly bodyguards in tow. Emily quickly ducked behind a row of hedges, her heart pounding. "What is she up to?" she whispered, peering through the leaves. Evelyn and her entourage moved with purpose, their expressions grim and uncompromising. Steeling her nerves, Emily carefully followed behind, keeping a safe distance. She couldn't afford to be caught, not when so much was at stake. The group eventually came to a stop in front of a nondescript office building, and Emily watched as Evelyn and her bodyguards disappeared inside. Furrowing her brow, she glanced around, making sure the coast was clear, before slipping through the door. The interior of the building was stark and utilitarian, with bare walls and fluorescent lighting. Emily crept forward, her footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. As she approached a set of double doors, she could hear the faint sound of voices. Pressing her ear against the wood, she strained to make out the conversation. "The project is progressing according to plan," a male voice was saying. "The subjects are responding well to the treatment, and the transformation is remarkable." Emily's eyes widened, her heart racing. What were they talking about? "Excellent," Evelyn replied, her tone cool and collected. "And what of the outside interference?" "It has been dealt with," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "We can't afford any more setbacks, Evelyn. The future of our community depends on the success of this project." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Backing away from the door, she turned and fled, her mind racing. She had to get this information to Detective Jackson, no matter what. As she burst out onto the street, she nearly collided with a pair of burly security guards. They grabbed her roughly, their expressions grim. "You're coming with us, ma'am," one of them growled, his grip tightening around her arm. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show her fear. "Let go of me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." The guards exchanged a glance, their eyes narrowing. "That's not for you to decide," the other one said, his voice low and menacing. "The HOA doesn't take kindly to trespassers." Panic began to rise in Emily's chest, but she forced it down, her mind racing. She had to get away, had to get the information to Detective Jackson before it was too late. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "I just want to go home." The guards hesitated, and Emily seized the opportunity. Twisting out of their grasp, she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to stop the HOA, no matter what it took. Evelyn Blackwood's brow furrowed as she watched the security feed, her eyes narrowing with irritation. That Wilkins woman had been more perceptive than she had anticipated, and now she posed a serious threat to the HOA's carefully laid plans. "Find her," she ordered, her voice clipped and icy. "I want her brought to me, alive. We can't afford any more distractions." The two guards exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. Evelyn's temper was notoriously short, and they knew better than to test her patience. "Yes, ma'am," one of them replied, his voice gruff. Turning on his heel, he hurried out of the room, the other guard close on his heels. Evelyn watched them go, her mind racing. She couldn't afford any more setbacks, not when they were so close to achieving their ultimate goal. The future of Oakwood depended on the success of their project, and she would stop at nothing to ensure its completion. Across town, Emily Wilkins burst through the door of her home, her heart pounding. She had to warn Detective Jackson, had to get the information to him before the HOA caught up to her. Frantically, she dialed his number, her fingers trembling. "Jackson, it's Emily," she said, her voice shaking. I think I found something, but they're after me. I need your help." On the other end of the line, Jackson's brow furrowed with concern. "Where are you, Ms. Wilkins? What happened?" I was at this office building, and I overheard Evelyn Blackwood talking about some kind of project, Emily said, her words tumbling out in a rush. They said they were dealing with outside interference, and that the transformation is remarkable. I think they're doing something terrible, detective, and I think they're going to come after me. Jackson's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Okay, Ms. Wilkins, I need you to stay put and keep your head down. I'm on my way, but you need to be careful. The HOA is not to be underestimated. But what about the information I have? Emily protested. We have to stop them before it's too late. I know, but rushing in without a plan is only going to get you killed, Jackson replied, his voice firm. Stay put, and I'll be there as soon as I can. We'll figure this out together, but you have to trust me. Emily hesitated, her mind whirling. She knew the detective was right, but the thought of the HOA getting away with their crimes made her blood boil. All right, she finally said, her voice small. Just hurry. Okay. I will, Jackson assured her. Hang in there, Ms. Wilkins. I'll be there soon. As the line went dead, Emily sank down onto the couch, her head in her hands. She couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Whatever the HOA was up to, it was clearly something sinister, and she knew they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Steeling her resolve, she glanced out the window, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't about to let the HOA win without a fight. If Detective Jackson couldn't get there in time, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Oakwood neighborhood, the two burly guards were closing in on their target. Their employer had made it clear that failure was not an option, and they knew better than to disappoint Evelyn Blackwood. As they turned the corner, their eyes narrowed, scanning the area for any sign of the troublesome Wilkins woman. They couldn't afford to let her slip through their fingers again. The game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The silence in Detective Jackson's car was palpable as he raced through the winding streets of Oakwood, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The information Emily had uncovered was deeply troubling, and he knew time was of the essence. Hang in there, Ms. Wilkins, he muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I'm coming. As he rounded the corner, his heart sank at the sight of two hulking figures stalking towards Emily's front door. Without hesitation, he floored the accelerator, the tires squealing as the car hurtled forward. The guards whirled around, their eyes widening in surprise as the car barreled towards them. Instinctively, they reached for their weapons, but Jackson was faster, swerving the car to the side and bringing it to a screeching halt. Get down, he yelled, already scrambling out of the vehicle, his own gun drawn. Emily, who had been peering nervously through the window, dropped to the floor just as the first shots rang out. The guards opened fire, their bullets shattering the glass and peppered the car's frame. Jackson ducked behind the vehicle, his mind racing. He had to get Emily to safety, but the HOA's goons were well armed and clearly willing to use lethal force. Gritting his teeth, he took a deep breath and returned fire, his shots accurate and precise. One of the guards stumbled, clutching his shoulder, but the other simply hunkered down and continued the onslaught. Suddenly, a movement in the corner of his eye caught Jackson's attention. Emily had emerged from the house, her face pale, but her expression resolute. In her hands, she held a baseball bat, and without hesitation, she charged towards the uninjured guard, swinging the weapon with all her might. The guard whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, and Jackson seized the opportunity. Taking careful aim, he fired a single shot, his bullet striking the guard squarely in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering to the pavement, and Jackson quickly moved to secure him, his heart pounding. Ms. Wilkins, are you all right? He called out, his gaze sweeping the area for any sign of additional threats. Emily, her chest heaving, nodded shakily. I think so, she replied, her voice trembling. Jackson let out a relieved sigh, quickly moving to check on the other guard. The man was still conscious, though his wound was clearly severe. Pulling out his radio, Jackson called for backup and an ambulance, his mind racing. "You did good, Ms. Wilkins," he said, his voice low. "But this is just the beginning. We need to get out of here, now." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the baseball bat. "What about them?" she asked, her eyes flickering towards the injured guards. "They're not going anywhere," Jackson replied, already ushering her towards his car. "We need to focus on staying one step ahead of the HOA. They're not going to give up that easily." As they sped away from the scene, Emily couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The confrontation had been a stark reminder of the dangers they were facing, and she knew that the HOA would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe," Jackson replied, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Somewhere the HOA can't find us, at least for now." Emily nodded, her mind whirling. She had come too far to back down now, and she knew that the fate of Oakwood, and perhaps even the world, hung in the balance. Whatever the HOA was up to, she was determined to stop them, no matter the cost. The rain had begun to fall again, its steady rhythm echoing through the silent streets of Oakwood. In a secluded corner of the neighborhood, Detective Jackson and Emily Wilkins huddled together, their expressions grim. "We need to move fast," Jackson murmured, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the HOA's goons. "They'll be looking for us, and we can't afford to stay in one place for too long." Emily nodded, her mind racing. "What do you think they're up to, Detective? What kind of project were they talking about?" Jackson's brow furrowed, his gaze darkening. "I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's clear that the HOA is willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it under wraps. And if what you heard is true, then we could be dealing with something much bigger than just a corrupt homeowners association." He paused, his expression grave. "Something that could put the entire community, or even the world, at risk." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, and she couldn't help but glance nervously over her shoulder. The thought of the HOA unleashing some kind of terrifying experiment on the unsuspecting residents of Oakwood was enough to make her stomach churn. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can't let them get away with this." Jackson nodded, his expression resolute. "I agree, but we need to be smart about this. We're dealing with an enemy that's not afraid to use violence to protect their secrets. We can't afford to make any reckless moves." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device. "This is a GPS tracker. I need you to plant it on one of the HOA members, preferably Evelyn Blackwood herself. That'll give us a way to track their movements and hopefully lead us straight to the heart of their operation." Emily's eyes widened, and she hesitated, her fingers trembling as she took the tracker. "But what if they catch me? I can't just—" "I know it's a risk," Jackson interrupted, his voice firm. "But it's the only way we're going to get the evidence we need to take them down. You're our best shot at getting inside their inner circle without raising any suspicions." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing with 1,000 doubts and fears. But the image of those two hulking guards, their weapons trained on her, was seared into her memory. She knew that the HOA would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and if she didn't act, the consequences could be devastating. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Jackson gave her a reassuring nod, his expression softening. "I'll be right here, monitoring the signal. The moment you get the tracker on Evelyn, get out of there and make your way to the rendezvous point. I'll be waiting for you." Emily took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. "All right, let's do this." As she made her way towards the HOA headquarters, the rain seemed to grow heavier, the droplets drumming against the pavement like a steady heartbeat. The air was thick with tension, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Gripping the tracker tightly in her hand, she approached the building, her steps measured and controlled. The burly guards at the door eyed her suspiciously, but a quick flash of her visitor badge seemed to satisfy them, and they stepped aside to let her pass. Heart pounding, Emily made her way down the dimly lit corridors, her eyes darting from side to side. Finally, she caught sight of Evelyn Blackwood, her imposing figure silhouetted against the window. Swallowing hard, Emily steeled her nerves and approached the HOA president, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to speak with you about the new community guidelines." Evelyn turned, her icy blue eyes narrowing as she regarded Emily. "What is it, Mrs. Wilkins?" she asked, her tone sharp and impatient. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the tracker. I just wanted to express my concerns. I'm worried about the direction the HOA is taking, and But before she could finish, Evelyn's expression darkened, and she held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm afraid I don't have time for your petty concerns, Mrs. Wilkins," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Our community is facing a threat, and we must take drastic measures to ensure its survival." Her eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. Evelyn's lips curled into a twisted smile, and she leaned in, her voice lowering to a whisper. "The zombies are evolving, Mrs. Wilkins, and we can't stop them."